Picture this. You're sitting in your favorite coffee shop, scrolling through medieval memes, maybe bragging about how you just deadlifted twice your body weight. You feel pretty tough, right? You've watched every season of Game of Thrones, binged Vikings on Netflix, and you're convinced that with modern training methods and nutrition, you could totally hold your own against some ancient warrior. Well, buckle up, Buttercup, because I am about to shatter that fantasy so completely that you'll need therapy just to feel confident opening a pickle jar again. A real Crusader Knight wouldn't just defeat you in combat. They would obliterate you so thoroughly that archaeologists would need dental records just to identify what was left. And I'm not talking about some Hollywood version of a medieval warrior. I'm talking about the genuine article. The absolute pinnacle of human warfare evolution that took centuries to perfect and produce killing machines so efficient they make modern special forces look like yoga instructors. Let me destroy your confidence systematically, starting with the most basic question. What exactly do you think a Crusader Knight was? If you're imagining some peasant who got lucky enough to find some armor lying around, you're already dead wrong. These weren't weekend warriors playing dress-up. They were the end product of the most sophisticated military training program ever devised by humanity. A program so brutal and comprehensive that it literally rebuilt human beings from the ground up into something that would barely register as the same species. The transformation started when these future warriors were 7 years old. 7. While modern children are learning to use tablets and arguing about bedtime, medieval pages were beginning a journey that would fundamentally reshape every fiber of their being. They weren't just learning to read and write. They were learning horse psychology, weapon maintenance, basic combat theory, and physical conditioning that would make CrossFit look like recreational stretching. Every single day for 20 years. No sick days. No mental health breaks. No summer camps where they made friendship bracelets. Just relentless, systematic preparation for one singular purpose: the complete destruction of other human beings in personal combat. At 14, they graduated to squire status, and this is where reality becomes so extreme it sounds like fiction. The physical conditioning alone would hospitalize modern Olympic athletes. We're talking about lifting and carrying stone blocks that weighed more than most people. Javelin throwing with spears deliberately made heavier than actual combat weapons to build superhuman strength. Wrestling matches that could continue for hours until someone was unconscious or surrendered. They had to master what medieval training manuals called the essential combat arts. Horsemanship that required controlling a 1,000-pound animal with your legs while your hands wielded death. Swimming and diving in full armor because rivers don't stop being obstacles during war. Archery and crossbow mastery that could thread needles at distances that would impress modern snipers. Rock climbing that prepared them to scale castle walls under arrow fire. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. Tournament fighting. These weren't friendly competitions. They were barely controlled attempts at murder, where knights tested their skills against other superhuman killers, often resulting in permanent injuries or death. And dancing, yes, dancing, because footwork in medieval combat was literally the difference between going home to your family and becoming fertilizer for someone's garden. Let me give you a specific example that will haunt your dreams. There is a documented case of a French knight named Jean de Carouge, who could perform what modern fitness experts would consider impossible. He could climb a siege ladder upside down, using only his hands, while wearing 60 pounds of steel armor. 60 pounds of perfectly distributed metal covering his entire body. And he's basically doing an inverted rock climbing exercise that would challenge modern athletes wearing nothing but spandex. The archaeological evidence backs up these seemingly superhuman achievements. Medieval manuscripts consistently show illustrations of fully armored knights mounting their war horses without any assistance whatsoever. No mounting blocks, no helping hands, just pure functional strength launching. a human being carrying the equivalent of a small child in armor onto the back of a massive animal. Modern biomechanical researchers studying these feats have concluded that medieval knights possessed strength and agility levels comparable to elite professional athletes, except they were doing it while carrying enough weight to break most people's backs. And that armor. Everything you think you know about medieval armor is Hollywood nonsense designed to make heroes look more heroic. The reality is absolutely terrifying. A complete suit of properly forged plate armor weighed between 30 and 60 pounds. And the weight distribution was so perfectly engineered that trained knights remained shockingly mobile. They could sprint, jump, roll, climb, and fight with an agility that would shock modern parkour athletes. But here's the part that should make you question everything about modern fitness. Wearing that armor required operating at nearly triple the normal energy expenditure for every movement. Walking in full plate armor burned energy at rates that would exhaust modern marathon runners in minutes. Running required almost double the normal metabolic cost. These knights were essentially doing high-intensity cardio training while carrying substantial weight loads for hours at a time during actual combat. Your 30-minute gym session doesn't even register on this scale. These men were operating human cardiovascular systems at limits that modern sports science considers unsustainable. And they did it while people were actively trying to kill them with sharp metal objects. The weapon training was equally devastating to your modern ego. Medieval sword combat wasn't the elegant dueling portrayed in movies. It was systematic destruction designed to break human bodies as efficiently as possible. Forensic archaeologists examining medieval battlefield remains consistently find evidence of multiple devastating wounds on individual skeletons before death occurred. These weren't clean, quick kills. Medieval combat was about overwhelming your opponent through superior technique, conditioning, and brutal efficiency. Knights practiced weapon drills with an intensity that incorporated progressive overload principles centuries before modern fitness discovered them. Except the stakes were infinitely higher than your gym routine. Fail to progress in modern training, and you might plateau. Fail to progress in medieval combat training, and you literally wouldn't survive your first battle. The mental conditioning was perhaps even more terrifying than the physical preparation. Medieval combat records document warriors continuing to fight effectively long after sustaining injuries that would incapacitate modern people completely. Multiple arrow wounds, deep sword cuts, broken bones, and they kept fighting with tactical awareness and deadly precision. This wasn't adrenaline or luck. This was systematic psychological conditioning that taught them to operate at peak performance regardless of physical trauma. When these knights went into battle, they weren't just individual fighters. They were components of a coordinated killing machine that weaponized physics itself. The cavalry charge was devastatingly simple mathematics. Mass times acceleration equals overwhelming destruction. A fully armored knight on a trained warhorse, wielding a couch lance and traveling at 20 miles per hour, delivered kinetic energy that could punch through shield walls and scatter entire military formations like bowling pins. Contemporary Muslim chroniclers writing about their Crusader enemies describe the psychological impact of watching these armored wedges approaching. Seasoned warriors, men who had fought for decades, would freeze in terror watching the perfectly coordinated approach of knights riding knee to knee in tight formation. The ground would shake. The sound was described as approaching thunder. The visual was an unstoppable wedge of steel, muscle, and horseflesh that could shatter the morale of entire armies before contact even occurred. And here's what makes this truly nightmarish for any modern person who thinks they could compete. These knights weren't just physically superior. They were psychologically engineered for violence in ways that would shatter modern minds completely. From childhood, they were conditioned to view combat not as a last resort or unfortunate necessity, but as their primary purpose for existing. Death in battle wasn't something to be feared or avoided. It was glorified as the highest possible honor. Physical pain wasn't something to be minimized or treated immediately. It was embraced as a pathway to proving worth and achieving glory. You, with your modern sensibilities, safety regulations, and psychological wellness awareness, would be mentally destroyed before any physical combat even began. The moment you saw a fully armored knight charging toward you with a lance leveled at your chest, the psychological impact alone would paralyze you completely. Medieval battle chronicles document experienced soldiers freezing in terror at the sight of an approaching cavalry charge. What possible chance would you have? Let's talk about the weapons themselves, because this is where reality becomes truly brutal. That sword hanging from a knight's belt wasn't just sharpened metal. It was a precisely balanced instrument designed through centuries of refinement to deliver maximum damage with minimum energy expenditure. Medieval longswords typically weighed between 2 and 4 pounds, but in the hands of a trained knight, they moved like extensions of their nervous system. The technique was equally devastating. Medieval sword combat incorporated cutting strikes, thrusting attacks, grappling techniques, and pommel strikes in fluid combinations that modern martial artists spend entire lifetimes trying to master. Knights trained these movement patterns until they became purely instinctive responses. Muscle memory so deeply ingrained that they could execute lethal techniques while exhausted, wounded, or fighting in complete darkness. And here's something that should completely shatter whatever confidence remains. Knights weren't just skilled with swords. They were masters of multiple integrated weapon systems. Lances for mounted combat that could pierce armor from horseback. Maces and warhammers designed specifically for crushing plate armor and the bones underneath. Daggers for close quarters finishing techniques. Even ranged weapons like crossbows for tactical engagement before closing to melee distance. You might have watched some instructional videos about medieval weapons or taken a weekend workshop. They spent 2 decades perfecting the use of every weapon in their arsenal until switching between them became as natural as breathing. The conditioning differences become even more stark when you consider pain tolerance and injury recovery. Modern athletes train intensively, but they also prioritize recovery periods, injury prevention, and pain management. Medieval knights trained through pain levels that would send modern people to emergency rooms. They fought through injuries that would sideline professional athletes for months. They developed pain tolerance that bordered on what we would now consider pathological. Contemporary battle accounts describe knights continuing to fight effectively with broken bones, deep lacerations, and puncture wounds that would send modern people into traumatic shock. This wasn't temporary adrenaline or exceptional cases. This was systematic conditioning that taught them to function at peak combat effectiveness regardless of physical trauma. Your modern advantages become completely irrelevant in this context. Your protein supplements, scientifically optimized training schedules, understanding of biomechanics, injury prevention knowledge, all of it becomes meaningless when facing someone who spent 20 years preparing for one specific purpose: the systematic destruction of other human beings in close personal combat. The speed differential alone would be overwhelming. You might think you have quick reflexes, but knights developed reaction times honed through years of combat training against other superhuman opponents. They could read subtle body language cues, anticipate attacks before they developed, and counter with lethal precision while you were still processing what was happening. Even if by some miraculous chance you managed to land a strike, you'd be hitting armor designed by master craftsmen specifically to deflect and absorb impact. That armor wasn't just protection. It was a psychological weapon. The sound of your best effort bouncing harmlessly off steel plate while a trained killer closed distance would be the last clear thought you had before experiencing medieval combat from the definitively losing side. The historical evidence is overwhelming and genuinely terrifying. Archaeological studies of medieval battlefields reveal the devastating effectiveness of knight combat techniques. Skeletal remains show evidence of precise, surgical strikes that maximize damage while conserving the attacker's energy. These weren't wild, emotional attacks driven by rage or desperation. They were calculated, efficient killing techniques executed by warriors who approached combat as both art and science. But perhaps the most sobering reality of all is this. The Crusader Knights weren't even the absolute pinnacle of medieval warfare capability. They were simply the most extensively documented military force across Europe. Similar training systems existed throughout the medieval world, producing warriors of comparable skill and lethality. The Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, Germanic military orders, Byzantine cataphracts, all following variations of the same brutal preparation methodologies. So the next time you're feeling particularly confident about your modern fitness achievements, remember this humbling reality. A 12-year-old medieval squire, after just 5 years of systematic training, possessed combat skills that would completely overwhelm most modern adults. A fully trained Crusader Knight represented the absolute culmination of the most effective warrior culture in human history. You wouldn't last seconds against a real Crusader Knight. You wouldn't survive long enough to understand how completely outmatched you were in every conceivable category. And that's not an insult to your capabilities or character. It's simply a testament to how extraordinarily capable these medieval warriors actually were. They were the product of a military system designed specifically to create human weapons of unprecedented effectiveness. And that system worked with genuinely terrifying efficiency. The gap between medieval military capability and modern civilian fitness isn't just significant or substantial. It's absolutely astronomical. We've gained incredible advances in technology, medicine, comfort, and safety, but we've lost something fundamental about human physical and mental potential. The Crusader Knights represent what humans can become when survival depends entirely on absolute mastery of organized violence. So remember this the next time you think modern people are necessarily tougher or more capable than our ancestors. Remember the Crusader Knight and be genuinely grateful you'll never have to test that theory in person, because the results would be swift, decisive, and absolutely devastating to everything you thought you knew about human combat capability.